In the spring of 1945, as the Third Reich collapsed into chaos and rubble, millions of people found themselves caught in a tide of violence, vengeance, and uncertainty that would reshape Europe forever. Among them were not just soldiers, but nurses, clerks, communications operators, and administrative staff who had served the German military machine in various capacities. These women, many barely out of their teenage years, suddenly found themselves designated as prisoners of war, stripped of the protections they had known and thrust into a world where the rules had dissolved along with the regime they had served. The story of one German woman's desperate plea to an American soldier reveals a side of the Second World War that often goes untold in the grand narratives of military triumph and geopolitical reshaping. It is a story that exposes the vulnerability of individuals caught in the machinery of history, the moral complexities faced by ordinary soldiers tasked with extraordinary decisions, and the thin line between civilization and chaos that war threatens to erase entirely. As American, British, and Soviet forces converged on Germany from all directions in those final weeks, the Wehrmacht's organized resistance crumbled. In its wake came not peace, but a period of profound disorder. Refugee columns stretched for miles along bomb-cratered roads. Concentration camp survivors, slave laborers, and displaced persons from across occupied Europe moved through the devastated landscape, many seeking revenge against their former captors or simply trying to survive another day. German civilians and military personnel alike faced an uncertain fate, particularly women who had any connection to the Nazi military apparatus. The woman at the center of this account was part of the Nachrichtenhelferinnen, the female communications auxiliaries who had served in various capacities throughout the German armed forces. These women had operated telephone switchboards, transmitted radio messages, decoded communications, and performed clerical duties that kept the military infrastructure functioning. As the war turned decisively against Germany, thousands of these auxiliaries found themselves in the path of advancing Allied armies, with nowhere to retreat and no clear status under international law. When American forces overran her position in the final days of the war, she became one of thousands of female German military personnel taken into custody. But custody by American forces did not guarantee safety in the chaotic environment of Germany's collapse. Liberated prisoners, displaced persons, and even some Allied soldiers from nations that had suffered grievously under German occupation viewed these German women with contempt, suspicion, and sometimes violent intent. The woman's desperation would lead her to make a plea that would test the humanity of one American soldier and reveal the profound moral challenges of military occupation. This is the story of a moment when warfare's grand strategies gave way to intensely personal decisions, when one woman's survival depended entirely on the character of a single soldier, and when the meaning of protection, duty, and humanity was tested in the crucible of war's chaotic aftermath. To understand the desperation of this German woman's plea, one must first comprehend the role women played in the Nazi war machine and the catastrophic situation that unfolded as that machine ground to a halt. The employment of women in the German military had been a contentious issue throughout the Third Reich. Nazi ideology had emphasized traditional gender roles, celebrating women primarily as mothers and homemakers in service of the Volk. Yet the demands of total war had gradually eroded these ideological boundaries. By 1945, approximately 500,000 German women served in auxiliary roles with the Wehrmacht, Luftwaffe, and Kriegsmarine. The Nachrichtenhelferinnen formed one of the largest contingents, providing essential communications support that kept German forces coordinated across multiple fronts. These women were not combatants in the traditional sense, but their work was vital to military operations. They wore uniforms, lived under military discipline, and in the chaotic final phase of the war, found themselves sharing the fate of retreating German soldiers. The woman in this account had likely joined the Nachrichtenhelferinnen sometime between 1943 and 1944, when recruitment intensified as German manpower reserves dwindled. Most of these auxiliaries were young, often between 18 and 25 years old, drawn from middle-class families with sufficient education to handle the technical demands of communications work. They received training in radio operation, telephone switching, and message encoding before deployment to command posts, airfields, or communication centers throughout occupied Europe and within Germany itself. As 1945 began, these women found themselves in an increasingly perilous position. The Red Army's advance from the east brought stories of brutal reprisals against German military personnel and civilians alike. The Soviet forces, having witnessed the destruction of their homeland and the deaths of millions of their citizens, often showed little mercy. German propaganda amplified these fears, sometimes accurately, sometimes with exaggeration, but the underlying reality was stark enough. German women in military service feared capture by Soviet forces above all else. The Western Allies, by contrast, were perceived as more likely to observe the rules of war and treat prisoners humanely. This belief was not without foundation. American and British forces generally adhered to the Geneva Conventions regarding prisoners of war, providing food, shelter, and medical care even as they processed thousands of captives daily. Yet even in American custody, German female prisoners faced dangers that military authorities could not always prevent or control. The period immediately following Germany's surrender on May 8, 1945, was marked by profound chaos. Millions of people were in motion across Europe. Among them were survivors of Nazi concentration camps, many of whom had suffered unimaginable brutality at German hands. There were also millions of forced laborers from Poland, the Soviet Union, France, and other occupied nations who had been compelled to work in German factories, farms, and military installations. These displaced persons, liberated but often without means or destination, sometimes sought retribution against any Germans within reach. In prisoner of war camps and temporary holding facilities established by American forces, this combustible mixture of populations created dangerous situations. Camp guards, often small in number relative to the masses they supervised, struggled to maintain order. Violence could erupt with little warning. German prisoners, especially women who were seen as particularly vulnerable, sometimes became targets of revenge attacks by other prisoners or even by civilians in the surrounding areas. The American soldier who would receive the German woman's plea was himself part of a vast citizen army that had crossed the Atlantic to fight in Europe. By the spring of 1945, American forces in Europe numbered over 3 million men, the majority of whom had been civilians just a few years earlier. They came from every corner of the United States, bringing with them the values, prejudices, and moral frameworks of American society in the 1940s. Most had been trained to fight, not to serve as occupation forces or prison administrators in a devastated country where humanitarian crises erupted daily. These soldiers faced moral complexities for which their training had not prepared them. They had liberated concentration camps and witnessed atrocities that defied comprehension. Many harbored deep anger toward Germany and Germans. Yet they also encountered ordinary German civilians and military personnel who seemed pitifully human in their suffering and fear. The tension between these conflicting emotions, between duty and compassion, between justice and mercy, would define the moral landscape of the occupation. The encounter occurred in the chaotic days following the German surrender, most likely in late April or early May of 1945, as American forces secured territory in southern or central Germany. The woman had been processed as a prisoner of war along with other members of her communications unit. She wore the gray-blue uniform of the Luftwaffe auxiliary services, now dusty and disheveled from days of retreat and confusion. Her documentation identified her role and unit, marking her officially as a prisoner entitled to protections under international law. But in the disorder of Germany's collapse, official designations meant little without someone willing to enforce them. She had been placed in a temporary holding facility, likely a commandeered building, farm compound, or hastily erected camp, along with other German prisoners. These facilities were overcrowded and undersupplied, as American forces struggled to process the enormous numbers of surrendering German military personnel. Food was scarce, sanitation primitive, and security inconsistent. Most critically, these facilities sometimes held mixed populations, German military prisoners alongside liberated forced laborers, concentration camp survivors, and displaced persons from across occupied Europe. The woman had quickly realized that her situation was precarious. Other prisoners in the facility, particularly men who had been forced to work for the German military or who had suffered under Nazi occupation, viewed the German women with open hostility. There had been incidents, threats, perhaps worse. The American guards were too few and too overwhelmed to provide constant protection. At night, the facility descended into darkness and fear. It was likely during one of the daytime periods, when American soldiers moved through the facility distributing rations or conducting administrative tasks, that she saw her opportunity. She approached one particular American soldier, identifying him perhaps by some kindness in his expression, some sign that he might listen, or simply because desperation left no room for careful selection. She spoke to him in whatever broken English she had learned, supplemented perhaps by gestures and the universal language of fear. The exact words of her plea have not been preserved in official records, but their essence is clear from the accounts that have survived. She begged him for protection. She explained that she was in danger from other prisoners, that the nights brought terror, that she feared for her life. She asked him to keep her safe, to ensure that the protections promised to prisoners of war would apply to her. The American soldier faced an immediate and profound dilemma. He was not a camp administrator or a high-ranking officer with the authority to reassign prisoners or reorganize facilities. He was a young man, likely in his early 20s, carrying a rifle and following orders in a situation that changed daily. His duty was to guard prisoners, not to become personally responsible for individual cases among the thousands under American custody. Yet here before him stood another human being in genuine distress. Her fear was palpable and, from his observations of the camp conditions, clearly justified. He had perhaps seen the hostile looks directed at German prisoners by liberated camp survivors. He might have heard rumors of violence in other facilities, of German prisoners beaten or worse during the chaotic nights when supervision was minimal. He could see that this woman, whether or not she bore moral responsibility for the regime she had served, was in immediate physical danger. The soldier's response would be shaped by multiple factors: his personal moral code, his understanding of military regulations, his feelings about Germans in general and this woman in particular, and his assessment of what was practically possible. Some American soldiers in similar situations hardened their hearts, viewing all Germans as complicit in Nazi crimes and therefore unworthy of special consideration. Others, perhaps influenced by religious faith, American ideals of fair treatment, or simple human compassion, felt compelled to act. This soldier chose to help. The exact nature of his assistance varied depending on his resources and authority, but it likely involved several elements. He may have arranged for her transfer to a different section of the facility, away from the most dangerous populations. He might have ensured that she received adequate rations, as malnutrition made prisoners even more vulnerable. Most importantly, he probably made his protection of her known to other guards and to the prisoner population, using his presence and authority to establish that she was not to be harmed. In the military culture of the time, such actions required careful navigation. The soldier had to avoid any appearance of inappropriate relationships with enemy prisoners, which could lead to disciplinary action. He needed to justify his protection of this particular prisoner in terms that made sense within military regulations and camp procedures. He may have framed it as ensuring compliance with Geneva Convention requirements, or as maintaining good order in the facility, rather than as a personal decision to protect one individual. The soldier's decision to protect the German woman created ripples that extended far beyond their immediate interaction. Within the prisoner facility, his actions sent a clear message: American authority would be used to prevent violence against prisoners, regardless of their nationality or prior service. This was not universally popular among the other prisoners, particularly those who had suffered under German occupation and saw all German military personnel as legitimate targets for retribution. The moral complexity of the situation was profound. The woman had served the Nazi war machine. Her communications work, however technical and distant from direct combat, had contributed to military operations that resulted in millions of deaths. The regime she had served had perpetrated the Holocaust, launched aggressive wars across Europe, and brought unparalleled destruction to the continent. Many of the prisoners and displaced persons in the same facility had been direct victims of Nazi policies. Their desire for retribution, while potentially leading to violence that violated camp rules, was rooted in genuine suffering and loss. Yet the soldiers' protection of the woman represented a crucial principle, that even enemies, even those who had served an evil cause, retained certain fundamental rights once they had surrendered. This principle distinguished democratic societies from totalitarian regimes. It reflected the values that Allied forces claimed to be fighting for, values embodied in the Geneva Conventions and in military codes of conduct. To abandon those principles in the moment of victory would undermine the moral foundation of the entire war effort. The soldier likely grappled with these considerations, perhaps not in abstract philosophical terms, but through the concrete reality of his daily decisions. Each time he checked on the woman's safety, each time he intervened to prevent harassment or violence, he was making a choice about what kind of person he would be and what kind of army he would serve in. These choices were made more difficult by the emotional toll of the war itself. Many American soldiers had by this point liberated concentration camps, or at least heard first-hand accounts from those who had. They had seen the skeletal survivors of Dachau, Buchenwald, or Mauthausen. They had walked through facilities designed for industrial-scale murder. These experiences created intense anger toward Germans and anything associated with the Nazi regime. To then be asked to protect a German woman who had served that regime required a deliberate suppression of those emotions in favor of a more abstract commitment to principles. The woman, for her part, found herself in a complex position as well. She was dependent on the protection of an enemy soldier, a man whose forces had defeated her nation and whose country she had been taught to view as an adversary. Yet her survival now depended entirely on his willingness to stand between her and other prisoners who wished her harm. This created a relationship of profound power imbalance and vulnerability, but also potentially one of grudging gratitude and human connection across the divide of war. As days passed, the immediate crisis gradually stabilized. American military authorities, recognizing the dangers inherent in mixed prisoner facilities, began implementing better segregation of populations. German military prisoners were separated from displaced persons and camp survivors. Female prisoners were moved to separate facilities with improved security. These administrative changes reduced the immediate threats that the woman had faced, though they came too late for some German prisoners who had suffered violence in the chaotic initial period. The soldier's protection had likely been crucial during those most dangerous days. His willingness to take personal responsibility for one prisoner's safety, to use his authority to prevent violence rather than simply look away, represented the best impulses of American military culture. It demonstrated that even in the morally ambiguous environment of occupation, individual soldiers could make choices that affirmed human dignity and the rule of law. Yet the story also illuminated the limitations of individual action within massive institutional structures. One soldier could protect one woman, but thousands of other prisoners faced similar dangers across occupied Germany. The systematic protection of prisoners required proper camp administration, adequate guard forces, clear policies, and consistent enforcement. These took time to establish, and in the interim, outcomes for individual prisoners often depended on chance encounters with particular soldiers whose personal character led them to act protectively. The immediate aftermath for the German woman prisoner likely involved transfer to a more secure facility designated for female prisoners of war. By the summer of 1945, American forces had established more organized prison camps with better security, adequate food supplies, and proper segregation of different prisoner populations. The chaos of the immediate post-surrender period gradually gave way to more systematic administration of occupation responsibilities. For the vast majority of German female auxiliaries captured by Western Allied forces, imprisonment was relatively brief. Unlike high-ranking Nazi officials or those implicated in war crimes, ordinary military personnel underwent denazification screening and were typically released within months to return to civilian life in occupied Germany. The woman in this account probably regained her freedom sometime in late 1945 or early 1946, returning to a homeland that had been transformed beyond recognition. The Germany she returned to was a nation in ruins. Major cities lay in rubble from years of Allied bombing. The economy had collapsed. Millions of German men were dead, missing, or still held in prisoner of war camps, particularly those captured by Soviet forces. Food was scarce, infrastructure destroyed, and the political future uncertain as the country fell under four-power occupation. For women returning from military service, the challenges were compounded by social stigma in some communities and the practical difficulties of rebuilding lives in such devastated circumstances. The American soldier who had protected her likely rotated home to the United States along with millions of other servicemen in the months following victory in Europe. He would have carried memories of the war that included both the horrors he had witnessed and the individual acts of humanity he had performed. Whether he ever learned of the woman's ultimate fate, whether he reflected on the moral significance of his protection, remains unknown. Most soldiers who performed such acts of individual kindness did so without expectation of recognition or lasting historical note. Yet the broader significance of such encounters extends far beyond the individual stories. The interaction between this German woman and the American soldier represented a crucial test of the principles that ostensibly differentiated the Allied cause from the Nazi regime. The Nazis had systematically violated the most fundamental rules of warfare and human decency. They had treated conquered populations with brutal indifference to suffering, denied basic protections to prisoners, and pursued policies of deliberate extermination. The Allied response to these crimes could have been pure retribution, a descent into the same lawlessness that had characterized Nazi occupation. That such retribution did not become official policy, that American and British forces generally maintained adherence to the Geneva Conventions and attempted to provide humane treatment even to enemy prisoners, represented a moral victory as important as any battlefield success. It was a victory achieved not through grand pronouncements but through thousands of individual decisions by soldiers like the one who protected this woman. These decisions, made in difficult circumstances and often against the tide of understandable anger, affirmed that civilization and the rule of law could survive even the most devastating conflict. The story also illuminates the particular vulnerability of women in the chaos of war's end. Female prisoners faced threats that male prisoners did not, and their protection required specific attention from military authorities. The initial failure to properly segregate prisoner populations and provide adequate security revealed gaps in military planning for occupation duties. These lessons would influence American military policy in subsequent conflicts and occupations, though the implementation of such lessons remained uneven. For historians examining the period of Germany's collapse and occupation, individual stories like this one provide essential texture to our understanding of how grand historical forces were experienced by ordinary people. The vast statistics of prisoners processed, displaced persons relocated, and administrative zones established can obscure the human reality of those chaotic months. Each number represented a person facing uncertainty, danger, and life-altering decisions. Each occupation soldier faced moral choices that military training had inadequately prepared them for. The encounter between the German woman and the American soldier represents one of countless moments when individual character determined whether the values proclaimed by democratic societies would be upheld in practice. Her desperate plea and his decision to respond positively created a small space of humanity within the vast machinery of military occupation. It demonstrated that even amid the legitimate demands for justice and accountability, there remained room for recognizing the common humanity of individuals caught in historical currents beyond their control. As we reflect on this story more than 8 decades later, its relevance extends beyond the specific context of 1945. It speaks to enduring questions about how societies should treat defeated enemies, how individuals should respond when confronted with others' vulnerability, and how the principles of human rights and dignity can be maintained even in the most challenging circumstances. The German woman's plea was a test of those principles. The American soldier's response provided one answer, demonstrating that humanity could survive even the total war that had consumed Europe. The story concludes not with perfect justice or complete redemption, but with the more modest achievement of basic protection extended across lines of national enmity. In the catastrophic landscape of 1945 Germany, such modest achievements represented the first steps toward rebuilding a civilized order from the ruins of war.